Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ceylon College of Physicians, this is Senaka Rajapaksa, President, to introduce you to the Young Physicians Forum for the month of July. As usual, we have two speakers who are senior registrars who will be presenting doing their presentations for the Young Physicians Forum over the next 1 hour or so. So, may I invite the first speaker, who is Dr. Artihai Srirangan, who is a senior registrar in respiratory medicine, working at the National Hospital of Sri Lanka, Central Chest Clinic, to speak on the road to recovery post-COVID pulmonary rehabilitation. Over to you, Dr. Srirangan.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning to everyone. My special thank to Ceylon College of Physicians for giving me this opportunity, and my special thank to my trainer, Dr. Gravini Karunatilaka, who gave me the idea about pulmonary rehabilitation. So, today we are going to discuss the post-COVID. What is the hottest topic now in all forum? So, we are going to discuss how the pulmonary rehabilitation helps in patient with the post-COVID. For the next 20 minutes, we are going to discuss what is pulmonary rehabilitation and how does it work, and what is the post-COVID and its sequelae, and how does the pulmonary rehabilitation help in patient with post-COVID-19. To start with, I like to introduce what is pulmonary rehabilitation. It is a comprehensive intervention based on a thorough patient assessment followed by a patient-tailored therapies which include exercise training but also education, behavior change designed to improve the physical and psychological condition of people with chronic respiratory disease and to promote long-term adherence to the self-enhancing behavior. And this concept of pulmonary rehabilitation originally developed for patients with chronic respiratory disease, mainly chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is evidence-based, and we have seen a lot of improvement in those patients. We know breathlessness during exercise is normal. We all experience it. But what is abnormal and pathological is that there is a significant limitation of physical activities in these patients. So, we can look at this in 2 points, lung problem versus exercise problem. If we see it as an exercise problem, then we can do intervention to improve the exercises versus try to improve the lung function in those patients who are already suffering from chronic respiratory disease. So, look at this point is important because it's very difficult for our patient as well as doctor to understand why we are trying to make patient to exercise in whom they already have a breathlessness even with a minimal exertion. That is why now the concentration have shifted from lung to exercise. To explain this further, I would like to go through this slide. Within a limited ventilator, within a exercise task, when as the exercises increases, when the exercises increases, the ventilation increase and soon they come to the ventilatory limit in the chronic respiratory disease patient. This is in fact different from what happened in the healthy individual, where it is normally limited by their cardiovascular function. So, in our patient, to improve the exercise, we can do, one is to improve the ventilatory limit, which is shown here. Mostly done by the therapy like bronchodilator or lung reduction therapy. Most are often helpful. Alternately, we can reduce the slope, which is shown here in the blue dotted line. So the patient can exercise within the pre-existing ventilatory limit. So exercise can move on further before they become breathlessness. So this is the main aim, to improve the time they are exercising is the main aim of the pulmonary rehabilitation. So what in fact it does, it will improve the skeletal muscles so that the metabolic demand of the muscle during the exercises is reduced. So, we know the metabolic demand of the muscle that activates the ventilation. So, what is the metabolic demand of the muscle? Here you can see during the exercise, the exercises in the muscle, the ATP is a currency of energy currency. So the ATP, while the muscle contraction, the ATP will depleted quickly. The ATP produced through the three pathway. Here first pathway is phosphocreatine, which phosphorylate and giving ATP, and the glycogen is changed to pyruvate to give ATP. These both two pathways are oxygen independent pathway. And once the pyruvate came from the glycogen enter into the mitochondria, and it is it underwent oxidative phosphorylation, which is an oxygen dependent pathway to produce the ATP. This is the oxygen dependent pathway of ATP production. And if there is an insufficient transfer of this oxygen into the mitochondria, then the pyruvate will change into lactate, and lactate is a waste product which is eliminated from our body as a form of carbon dioxide. So it will increase the ventilation. So if there is any oxygen in chronic respiratory disease patient, if they have a oxygen deficient, so there will be an increased production of lactate, which will aggravate the ventilation and make the patient to prematurely stop their exercises and make them fatigue. So how does this pulmonary rehabilitation helps? This research show after a period of pulmonary rehabilitation, you can see there is an increased uptake of oxygen by the muscles, and also there is an increased amount of work rate by the muscle. That is, the patient can do exercise longer, and that is denoted in the green boxes. And you also can see it also reduces the lactate production, and it also reduces the time to activate the ventilation. This is very important due to the pulmonary rehabilitation. It also changed the oxygen in the muscle, the oxidative enzyme, increase the mitochondrial oxidative enzyme. So, we know the pulmonary rehabilitation through this graph, we know it is help to improve the cellular mechanism, but not shown here. It also increase the pulmonary mechanics. So our patient can make it possible our patient to exercise longer. That is the main aim of pulmonary rehabilitation. And is it only the exercise? For that, is there any other thing which included in the pulmonary rehabilitation? For that, I would like to explain this spiral of disability. When the patient, we know, when the patient with a chronic lung disease have a lung functional impairment, which lead the patient dyspneic. And for the dyspneic, patient will make them to avoid the activity. And because of avoidance due to the adaptation, they will become more and more inactivity. Because of the avoidance activity, the skeletal muscle become deconditioning and lead to dysfunctional of skeletal muscle. This will again lead to aggravate the dyspnea. So this is a vicious cycle, and move and make the patient disabled. So, and with that, due to the inactivity, the patient will develop social isolation, depression, and loss of independence. So, the immobility also have an additional impact, and it will reduce the quality of life of our patient. So, though exercise is important, to improve the quality of care, we need an integrated care. That is the pulmonary rehabilitation. So, the pulmonary rehabilitation includes exercise, but also it includes the nutritional support, psychosocial support, and the education. So, it is an integrated structured program which delivered by a group of healthcare professionals, including the consultant respiratory physician, physiotherapist, nurse, occupational therapy, to provide to improve the quality of life of the patient. So if we see the goals of the pulmonary rehabilitation, it will reduce the symptoms burden and it will maximize the exercise performance of the patient and make them to independence, and it will improve the quality of life and promoting the long-term health enhancing behavior. These are our main goals. And now we'll see how we are going to incorporate our pulmonary rehabilitation into the COVID patients. So now the post-COVID-19, it's the emerging new pandemic, because up to now we know 186 million cases are identified. With that, 170 million survivors are there. And there is a recent study shows, which is published in July 5th. It shows, it was done in the German. They have seen after the hospital admission, after they have follow-up patient is 3 months, 6 months and 12 months. After 12 months also, only 22% of patients are completely free of symptoms. So it means they have 80% of patients still have symptomatic at the end of 12 months. The most frequent symptoms are exercise capacity and fatigue. And before going into post-COVID, just get some idea about what is acute COVID and the post-COVID. Acute COVID is sign and symptoms which last up to 4 weeks. It's acute. And it's again divided into, according to the WHO criteria, mild and moderate to severe. Mild, it include patient with non-hospitalized. In our setting, the patients in the intermediate center also. It's around 80 to 85. And the moderate to severe patient, the hospitalized patient, it's around 15 to 20. And the post-acute COVID or the long COVID, it's again divided into two, ongoing or chronic COVID. Ongoing COVID is up to 4 to 12 weeks. And the post or chronic COVID, it is from beyond the 12 weeks. In this patient, we can see patient with a persistent symptoms in the hospitalized patient. But in iceberg, we are not seeing patients who are not hospitalized, who are in the intermediate center, have persisting symptoms or newly developing symptoms also coming under the long COVID or post-acute COVID criteria. Before going into the long COVID, we'll see what is the pathophysiology. It's like the same as the acute COVID, like it's a viral specific, and the immunological, like other autoimmune diseases. And here the added one is the sequelae of the post-critical illness, which is a new or worsening abnormality of physical, cognitive, and psychiatric domain after the critical illness. And who are the patient going to develop the post-acute COVID? These are the risk factors. Normally the old age group and the patient who receive ICU or HTU care with the assisted ventilation and underlying comorbidities and females. These are the patients whom we suspect they will going into develop post-acute COVID. And it's a multi-organ. Not only it's involving the pulmonary, it also involves the other such as neurological, psychiatric, and cardiovascular and cutaneous. And we don't know how long the effect of multi-organ effect going to last, whether it will cause a chronic ill health to our patient. So these are the study shows. It was done in Italy. It shows after 60 days follow-up of patient who was admitted in the hospital, 32% have 2 symptoms and 55% have 3 symptoms. And the common symptoms are fatigue and dyspnea. And this is again done in Rome. It also shows after 60 days follow-up, the main symptoms are fatigue and breathlessness. So here we'll see what are the pulmonary sequelae of post-COVID. It is a spectrum of pulmonary manifestation, from reactive airway dysfunction syndrome to secondary interstitial lung disease such as organizing pneumonia, non-specific interstitial pneumonia, and acute interstitial pneumonia, and pulmonary embolism, and the opportunistic infection. And commonly they are present like dyspnea and cough. So how we are going to follow up this patient? So if the patient after severe disease who are admitted to HTU, we are going to follow up this patient in 4 to 6 weeks to see any early symptoms and refer them to the pulmonary rehabilitation. And the patient who have mild to moderate pneumonia, the patient who are hospitalized, and all the patient with intermediate center with mild the pneumonia, we are going to review the patient in 12 weeks, and if they having the symptoms, then we are going to assess the patient in the integrated multidisciplinary team and going to refer the patient to the pulmonary rehabilitation. So how we are going to adapt the pulmonary rehabilitation to deliver rehabilitation in the COVID-19. For this, first we are going to assess the patient prior to enrollment, and we need to identify what are the patient's goal, and we are going to, it's an individualized program and with the initial and ongoing assessment. So who are the patient we are going to include in this in this program? The patient who are discharged from hospital, all patient who received ICU or HDU care, and patient with respiratory symptoms with or without evidence of pneumonia. And we also going to include patient who did not require hospital admission but have a persisting symptoms. And we are going to exclude the patient who have the predominantly other problems or any active cancer or any end of life care or patient who needed inpatient multidisciplinary rehabilitation. So what is the goal in the pulmonary rehabilitation in post-COVID patient? To support a full recovery, to support the symptom management, to support a return to normal life. So how the program is set up? Normally we are doing it as a chest clinic. We are the social distancing and the faster airflow is possible. And normally 4 to 6 weeks after the recovery of COVID-19. And in the pre-appointment screening, we are see any need for oxygen at rest and the physical exertion and their dyspneic level and physical, cognitive and emotional status and anxiety and depression. And we need to exclude the complication of COVID-19. Those are the myocarditis and acute deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism before enroll these patients into the pulmonary rehabilitation. And what are the adaptation of the rehabilitation from the normal pulmonary rehabilitation, which is include exercise, nutrition and education. Other than that, we need to address these three things in COVID patient: the fatigue, the cognitive function and the mood disturbance such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and the return to work. These are the three main things we are adapting to this program. So the exercise component, just like same pulmonary rehabilitation, which include the resistance exercise for the upper lower limit exercises and endurance exercise with walking and the cycling, and balance functional exercises and including other breathing exercises. Normally we can ask the patient to take position that reduce the breathlessness like shown in this picture, and other breathing techniques such as control breathing, space breathing and pursed-lip breathing and diaphragmatic breathing to improve the breathlessness. And just see what are the fatigue management. We can provide sleep hygiene to this patient and spacing strategies. Try to do a little task between the heavier and gradual graded exercise and gradual resumption of activities. And especially we need to ask the patient to adjust their expectation. Set a realistic goal based on how they are feel. And they can ask others to help during the fatigue. And other aspects such as nutrition, diet enrichment and the swallowing retraining and the psychological care to address the anxiety and depression and the cognitive impairment. Most probably these are the healthy patients who develop the diseases, and the post-traumatic stress disorder is a main thing we need to address in this patient. And the social issue. The main social issue is the return to work, because these are the healthy individuals who help the economy of the country and the family. So ask them to gradually return to work and taking on a role that is easier for them to manage. These are the things we are going to address in this patient. And we'll see how rehabilitation, what are the evidence which support the rehabilitation help in patient with COVID-19. Only a very little data is there. It was done in Germany. They have included, it's a retrospective study. They have included patient who was discharged from the hospital for a 5 month, and they have measured the motor performance and the lower extremity function and exercise tolerance with the Barthel index and the 4-minute test, and standing and sit up position, and the 6-minute walk test. And these are the results. After 3 weeks of pulmonary rehabilitation, they have seen a significant improvement in the short performance physical index, that is the balance, and the 4-minute walk test, and 5 times sit to stand up. And it also shown that Barthel index also significantly improve in these patients. This is the other study which was published in the European Respiratory Journal. It also they have done a 3-week inpatient pulmonary rehabilitation, and before and after the pulmonary rehabilitation, they have assessed the 6-minute walk test and the forced vital capacity. And it also shown after the 3 weeks, only after the 3 week of pulmonary rehabilitation, there is a significant improvement in the meters they can walk. In the mild disease, around 48, and the severe and critical COVID patient, it is around 124 meters, which is significant improvement only with the 3 weeks of pulmonary rehabilitation. And it also, there is an increase in the forced vital capacity also, 7% and the 11% the critical illness. And we can see the SpO2 also increase after the rehabilitation. And the breathing rate, which the dyspnea also reduced with the pulmonary rehabilitation. So this study shows that pulmonary rehabilitation is a feasible and safe, effective therapeutic option for patients with COVID-19, independent of the disease severity. We are waiting. We have started the pulmonary rehabilitation program after the third wave, the patients who have discharged from the National Hospital, and we are waiting to see what is the results. And we like to share once we have done the rehabilitation program for those patients. So summary, we for the last 20 minutes, we have I think you can answer this question. We have seen what is pulmonary rehabilitation and how does it work, and what is the pathophysiology behind the post-COVID, and who are at risk to get the post-COVID, and how we are going to follow up this patient, and how pulmonary rehabilitation help in these patients to recover. So the take-home message, the post-acute COVID are substantial burden not only for our patients and the family, but also for the healthcare services and economy of our country. And we need a multidisciplinary approach which include the pulmonary rehabilitation to necessary to successfully limit and treat the long-term sequelae of COVID-19, and understanding the need for long-term care in COVID-19 patient and early referral to the post-COVID clinic will help in accelerated recovery in those patients. These are my reference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sri Rangan, for that excellent presentation on a very topical, timely subject. I wonder whether there are any questions from the audience. And Upul.
Dr. Sri Rangan, it was an excellent lecture. You mentioned a study, a German study, where only 22% of the people hospitalized were free of symptoms. Say, I can't remember how long afterwards.
After 1 year of that is the longest study. It was they have followed up the prospective study. They have followed patients at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months, and those are hospitalized patients. So most probably in other countries they are hospitalizing the moderate to severe patient. So they followed in each 3 months, and at the at the 12 months after finishing the study, only 22% patients are free of all symptoms.
Yes, you have answered part of my question. My question was to be that what were the criteria to admit those patients to the hospital. You already answered that question. The next question is whether there was an improvement in the pulmonary function from the 3rd to 6th to 12 months, or was there any worsening in these patients?
in this study, they have taken the most probably they have taken the patients and they have done the lung function in before starting, and every for 3 months and the 6 month and 12 month, and they have shown there is an improvement in the lung function, post vital capacity also. They didn't study with whether effect of steroid in those patients. It's not studied in that study.
Yeah, thank you. So even if somebody is symptomatic at the 3rd or 6th month, there's a chance that the person
Yes.
might improve by the end of 1 year.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pul. There is a question from somebody in the audience. What is the role of steroid inhalers in these patients?
Normally, there is a evidence for the budesonide. It will help in those patients because there is a pulmonary CFR is a wide spectrum. So it for the reactive dysfunctional respiratory disease to the interstitial lung disease and interstitial lung disease. So there is a place for the budesonide. Budesonide inhaler with 1,800 microgram daily has shown there is a benefit for those patients.
Is that in the acute phase or in the, are you saying it's also, there is evidence for the post-acute stage?
It is in the post-COVID. In the post-COVID only. I don't know the.
Are there any studies on it? I don't think there are any studies in the post-acute phase.
Excuse me, I have a question. What about the place of steroids and other disease-modifying drugs in rehabilitation? I'm asking oral steroid. Yeah.
If the patient have an interstitial lung disease, if proven organizing pneumonia or non-specific interstitial pneumonia, then there is a place for oral steroid for in those patients. But the studies are limited because the COVID is only for last 2 years. So we need to see the studies in the coming months or coming years only. We can see the improvement. But we have started because already we know the steroids are helpful in patient with the interstitial lung disease. So it's a secondary interstitial lung disease due to the post-COVID. So there will be a place for it. So we started researchers in the subject. So we need to wait to see those results.
So is that the dose you give 1 milligram per kg or then any other dose?
No.
Specific?
There is no proper guideline to show what is the amount of steroid we can give, because there is an increased risk of infection. We normally practice 0.5. It is a patient tailored, and we need to decide with other comorbidities, and normally we are giving 0.5 milligram per kg dose.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take just one question if there is anything from the audience. I have just one small question. You talked about these teams, the multidisciplinary teams. In what hospitals in this country are these teams already set up?
It is well set up in our central chest clinic.
Yes.
And most of the chest clinic are having the pulmonary rehabilitation setup.
The multidisciplinary setup is there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Srirangan, for an excellent presentation, and particularly for keeping to time and taking the questions very well. Thank you so much. Our next talk, I think it's time now, is by Dr. Anne Dushanti Darjini, who is going to speak on managing the diabetic foot in resource-limited settings. Dr. Darjini is a senior registrar in medicine from Teaching Hospital, Jaffna. Over to you, Dr. Darjini.
Good morning, all of you. First, I would like to thank our chairperson, sir, for that kind introduction. And I would like to thank the Ceylon College of Physicians for giving me this great opportunity. And also, I would like to thank my consultants of University Medical Unit of Teaching Hospital, Jaffna, who were guiding me on this topic. For next 25 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about managing the diabetic foot in resource-limited settings. So, this is my outline. includes introduction, understanding the diabetic foot disease, food risk assessment, risk classification, management, and what are the challenges we are facing in this part of the world, and how we can prevent and educate our patients. So, with the data available in 2019, approximately 463 million of adults were living with diabetes, and it is estimated by 2045 it would rise to 700 million, and it estimated that 15% of them are having diabetic foot-related disorders. And compared to the Western countries, in Southeast Asia, we are having more prevalence of diabetes and diabetic-related foot problems. In Sri Lanka, in 2008, it was estimated around 10.3% of the people are having diabetes, and among them, 10 to 20% developed foot-related problems. The most recent study released in 2019, that is Colombo Urban Study, which showed around 27.5% of patients are diabetes and 30.3% are pre-diabetes. Even though the study is done in urban area, but it showed during the last decade, the prevalence of diabetes is going to be rise in our country. Regarding the major limb amputation, there is a study done in Teaching Hospital Karapitiya during the period of 2013 to 2014. They included 1885 cases of major lower limb amputation, where they found around 37.6% of people had diabetic foot-related problem. And they found around 50% of the limb amputations were directly or indirectly due to diabetes mellitus. And what about the morbidity and mortality of foot ulcers? In 1994 to 1998, there's a study done in Liverpool where they concentrated about the morbidity and mortality purely due to the diabetic ulcers. Where they found is 5-year mortality was 45, 18, and 55% of all diabetic-related foot ulcers. And they concluded all type of diabetic foot ulcers are associated with high morbidity and mortality despite of other risk factors. So, once the patient develops diabetic foot ulcer, itself an independent risk for their morbidity and mortality. So, what is the part of foot care services in diabetes, foot ulcers, and amputation? Again, there is a peer-reviewed study which had been done in southwest of England. What they found is, you can see in year 2005, only there were 2 established foot care services, where at that time they had high amount of major amputation. But the course of the empowerment of the foot care services, by 2050, the amputations were well reduced. So not only for that, in view of our patients, when they lose their leg or their both limbs, they lose their earning capacity, and also our economy of the country will lose. And also the foot care cost and healthcare cost is high. Apart from that, we can treat the patient when they are coming with diabetic foot ulcers and we can amputate them. But the major part is nearly 80% of these amputations can be prevented when we intervene and identify the risk foot. So, what is the diabetic foot disease? Before we are going to prevention and manage our challenges, we have to know what is diabetic foot disease. It is infection, ulceration, or destruction of tissues of the foot associated with neuropathy or peripheral arterial disease in lower limb of patients with diabetes. So, when a patient with diabetes, when they are having a small callosity, that foot is known as foot at risk. Then they can develop small ulcer through ulceration and infection, and ultimately it will go into amputation. As we all know, the diabetes is a multifactorial disease. It can affect the macro and microvascular disease. When we are concentrating of the lower limb, mainly the sensory neuropathy, motor neuropathy, and autonomic neuropathy are more prominently seen. And when they have all these neuropathies, they will have the less protective sensation and foot deformities, and they will have the abnormal pressure points, and ultimately it will lead to callus formation. And when they have the coexistent peripheral arterial disease, it will lead to ischemia and poor wound healing. And ultimately, they will get recurrent ulceration and prolonged infection. And at one point, we have to do the amputation. Before we have to stop, we have to see what are the patients are having foot risk. So it can be the general and local factors. The general factors would be uncontrolled hyperglycemia and prolonged duration of diabetes and peripheral vascular disease, blindness, and coexisting other comorbidities like chronic kidney disease and the old age. And local factors includes peripheral neuropathy, structural foot deformities, callus trauma, and most importantly, improper footwear, and prolonged elevated pressure, and prior ulceration and amputation. Before we have to screen, we have to get their demographic data and past medical history, like symptoms of neuropathy, ischemia, and their smoking status, and previous foot ulceration and amputation. And then we have to examine their foot with dermatological examination, and we have to see whether they are having already foot deformity and sensory function, arterial blood supply, and footwear examination. These are the key pattern of deformity we can encounter, like cloto deformities, hammertoe deformities, charcot deformity, and bunion and overlapping toes. So the neuropathy examination, we all aware, like the 10-gram monofilament examination, which includes 9 areas in the plantar surface, and 1 area in the dorsum of the foot includes 10, and we have to make the monofilament to bend so that we are giving 10 gram of pressure. And if the areas are not identified, then they are having the significant neuropathy. And this is another easy test which have been illustrated in NICE guidelines, like touch the toe test. Here we can touch the right foot, first and fifth toes. Likewise, in left foot, first and fifth toes. And then we have to come back with the third toes of each foot. If they are having 2 or more less sensation, then they are having the significant neuropathy. This type of tests we can do in our busy clinics also. And the conventional vibration test, we all aware, like vibration with a tuning fork of 128 Hertz. And also this is the biotheciometry, which is available in endocrinology clinic. And there are newly available portable vibrotip meters are there. And also other components like pinprick sensation and ankle reflexes we can check. Regarding the vascular assessment, initially starts with symptoms, whether the patients are having neuropathic symptoms, when they are having the intermittent claudication symptoms, and we can check the dorsalis pedis and posterior tibial pulses and capillary refilling time, and whether they are having profound potential ischemia with toe tip ulceration and cold peripheries. And if they are having absence of pulses, we can go with the non-invasive vascular assessment with ankle brachial index and toe brachial index, and with other imaging like arterial and duplex scan. The ankle brachial pressure index, we all know the normal limits. If it is less than 0.6, then that is severe. If it is in between 0.6 to 0.9, then they are having definite vascular ischemia. And this is also again validated. There are many studies regarding the ankle brachial pressure index, but this is the recent one done in our near part of the world, that is in India in 2020 they have done. And they concluded then ABPI can be used as a routine tool in patients with diabetic foot-related diseases. And again, this is toe brachial index, similar to the ankle brachial index, but here we are checking the brachial pressure and the toe pressure. Because if the patient is having significant neuropathy, there are false positive results came out with ankle brachial index. So there is a study done in published in Diabetic Care. They compared the measures for the lower limb arterial disease. So they concluded that qualitative waveform analysis and the toe brachial index are more effective than ankle brachial index when the patient is having significant neuropathy. Rather than this, can we identify whether this patient is having neuropathic limb or the ischemic limb? Yes, of course. If the sensation is reduced and the foot is warm with ulcers on the plantar surface and the foot pulses are palpable and the callus is present with dry skin and fissure, then it would be the neuropathic limb. But if the sensations are normal, but the pulses are absent and they are having tip-toe ulceration, then it favors the ischemic limb. But most of the patients are having combination of both, that is neuroischemic limbs. And another most important part of the examination is assessment of footwear. It should have the secure closure system with less seaming, extra depth, and stable heel counter with roomy toe box and hard outlet show. So here this is illustrated that here the toes are crowded, so they might have the pressure wounds. And here again the tip pointed footwear will hurt their sole. So it should be having the good room for their toes also. And this is the assessment system is available already, which is published by the Health Ministry and also the collaboration of Diabetes and Cardiovascular Initiatives. Here, what I mentioned is illustrated. So we can use this tool as a guide in our busy clinic setup to screen our patients. So how, after the assessment of risk, how we can classify? It again depends on the loss of protective sensation, deformities, foot pulses, and history of prior ulceration with other demographic data. So this is the NICE guideline risk classification where they classify the risk as low risk, moderate, and high. When the patient is having small lesion with callus formation, they can be followed up annually. But with neuropathy or non-critical limb ischemia, we can follow up them 6 monthly. But if the patient is having high risk with prior ulceration and profound ischemia and neuropathy, at least we have to follow them quarterly. And again, this is another classification given by modified ADA risk, diabetic risk classification. This is concerning the priority of the treatment. It can be urgent, high, moderate, low, and very low risk. So when the patient is having open wound and active pathology, that should be immediately attended and the specialist should see the patient. And if the patient is having long-standing problem, they can be followed up at least monthly. And the low-risk patients can be followed up every 4 monthly, and very low-risk patients, they are without any problem, at least we have to educate them annually. How we can manage our patients? It involves offloading of the foot, control of foot infection and ischemia, wound debridement, and wound dressing. The offloading means the relief of mechanical stress from a specific region of the foot. So these are some examples, that is wedge. Here you can see, here the hind foot is offloaded with the prominent forefoot heel. And here again, this is forefoot offloader. And again, these are some commercially available shoes with the rocker bottom with different areas of the joints can be offloaded. And again, these are some cast system. Here in the high ankle walker, here the pressure is transmitted above the ankle, so the foot is offloaded and it promotes the healing. And again, this is with the adjustable peg insole. We can adjust the sole of the footwear. And basic management of ulcer, which includes our surgeon's help also. It includes resolving the foot ulcers, decrease the recurrent rate, and we have to promptly treat the infection with antibiotic therapy, and we have to see whether they are going into osteomyelitis. And at most important is optimize the glycemic control and treat the malnutrition and patient education. These are some commercially available treatment methods known as negative pressure wound therapy, where they applying the negative pressure and suck the exudate. So it will promote the healing. But it is contraindicated if the patient is having active bleeding, as it will promote the bleeding. And this is again 3C patch system, where they are using a biological patch made up of patient's own blood, which consists of matrix of fibrin, leukocytes, and platelets. So it will promote the healing. And again, this is a conventionally available product, that is polyhexamethylene biguanide, that will also promote the wound healing. This is a small device known as Natrox oxygen wound therapy, where they deliver the 98% of humidified oxygen directly to the wound. So it will promote the wound healing by giving the active oxygen. And another adherent wound therapy is ergostat therapy. It is consists of lipidocolloid technology. It will adhere to the wound and it will promote the healing of diabetes as well as venous ulcers. Even though all these methods of treatment are indicated in NICE guidelines, but the cost is very high. And other new emerging treatment modalities are growth factors, bioengineered skin substitutes, extracellular matrix proteins, metalloprotein modulators, and hyperbaric oxygen, but these are still in trials. So, we have come through the management, but what are the challenges we are facing in our part of the world? It can be patient-related and treatment-related. The lack of knowledge and malpractice of foot care is the major problem in our part, and adherence of treatment another problem. Related to treatment, we are lacking of specialized podiatrists and specialized healthcare professionals and clinics, which confine to the diabetic foot care, and limited availability of orthosis, and high cost of proposed mechanical treatments, and other limited evidence of new treatment options. Can we overcome these challenges? Yes. When we are concerning to the patient-related problems, we can educate our patients and involve them in the management and promote the shared care. And also we can conduct awareness program in community level, and we can conduct annual foot care screening program and motivate our patients to adhere to the treatment. And regarding the treatment-related problems, we can train the nurses and medical officers in diabetic foot care. Even we can recruit the retired nursing officers and medical officers to help with this problem. And also at least we can train our house officers and registrars in wards to screen the diabetic patients. At least they have been discharged with the available screening tool we are having already. With that we can discharge. And also we can facilitate the orthosis workshops. And if the fund is not available, we can raise the fund from the community with the health-minded people. And if the patient is having moderate to high risk foot, we can have the multidisciplinary approach, which includes physicians, vascular surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, and physiotherapists and specialized nurses and occupational therapists to minimize the amputation. So, can we prevent the amputation? Yes. If we care our foot like our face, we can prevent the amputations. So, we can educate our patients to wash the limb with soap and water, dry well, including in between toes, as indicated here, and we can ask them to apply moisturizer, but should avoid in between toes because it can facilitate the fungal colonization. And we can ask them to cut the nails straight and correctly. Moreover, use correct the shoes and check inside for foreign bodies, and they should feel and inspect their foot by themselves as shown in this picture or by their household people, and get period foot examination, take care of sugar levels, and do regular exercise. And they should not walk barefootedly. They have to quit smoke, and they should not use hot water to wash their feet, and they should not use the socks with synthetic materials, and never treat the cones and colors by themselves, and never use pointed shoes. So ultimately, the diabetic related amputations and diabetic related foot diseases are emerging problem. Even though we are concerning to the pandemic during this year, this is the non-communicable disease with a high burden to the health and economy. So we can prevent nearly 80% of the amputations can be prevented by the education of our people. So the diabetic foot care nutshells would be prevention and treatment of diabetic foot disease is a challenge. It is associated with high morbidity and mortality and high healthcare cost. Identification of foot at risk by empowering the patient is the key to success. Knowledge, attitude, and practice towards preventing the diabetic foot disease by healthcare personnel is lacking. Expanding the service related to podiatry is an urgent need. These are my references. And thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darshini. We have time for some questions. Upul.
Thank you, Dr. Darshini, for the excellent lecture. Now, treating diabetic foot ulcers or diabetic foot wounds is a thankless job. The local experience is that when a person comes with a diabetic foot ulcer, nobody wants that person. And the attitude of a doctor is to get the person out of the hospital as soon as possible, because otherwise the surgical wards will be full of patients, and usually those patients are sent to the surgical casualties. Wounds are cleaned and then discharged back to the medical ward, and the medical ward discharges back to the patient to the payment. What is your local experience in Jaffna, and is there a way of overcoming this problem?
Yes, sir. It's the same problem we are having in our Jaffna Teaching Hospital too. But because I take this problem as a major thing, so that's why I'm doing a research on this diabetic foot care, how the patient have their knowledge, attitude, and practice. And as well, I'm examining their feet and classifying their feet as risk, whether they are having low, high, or moderate risk. But in our clinical practice, as you mentioned, many patients with a established diabetic foot, they are going to the surgical casualty. So what I would suggest is, when we are diagnosing a patient with diabetes mellitus, with the first consultation, we have to have a chat with the diabetic foot related problems. Because there is a study done recently in Australia known as OSDIAB study, where they found, even though before they are developing the macro and other microvascular diseases, the diabetic related neuropathy is predated. So when we are diagnosing a patient with diabetes, it's the first time we have to implement the diabetic foot care. So at least annually, we are having the routine medical clinics. So we can identify those patients and just talk a little bit like, how is your foot? Well, we can just have a look. We don't need to go and palpate the pulses with the busy clinics. But I mentioned the touch the toes. Just touching the 3 toes of each limbs will give a good amount of evidence of neuropathy. And just look at their feet and footwear. Most of the patients are with slippers, and some of them are coming with barefooted feet. At least we can tell whether you can afford to buy. Another thing is affordability. So just telling the patient to buy a proper footwear, it won't work. So at least we can identify the patients with poor socioeconomy. Those patients are mainly coming with barefooted, and again they are going into the burden of economy, because when they are going into amputation, then it will make them more sufferable. So we can identify those patients, and at least we can, in our ward setup, we are having a ward welfare fund. So when the patient is admitted to the ward, so we are identifying those patients and we are providing the small amount of care or some medications that can be provided by the ward fund regularly. So these kind of small implementations can be prevent the major amputation, I think, sir.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. There are many methods we use in low resource settings in providing diabetes foot care and wound care. I provide podiatric care and advanced wound care in Colombo, and most of the methods shown are not needed for basic foot care and wound management. That's a comment from someone in the audience. Would you like to respond to that? Before you start, I'd like to comment that I think you touched mostly on what is appropriate and available in a low resource setting. Although you started off with the advanced techniques, you did highlight that the important things were the ones which you can implement in a low resource setting. But would you like to comment to this question?
Yes, of course. Because why I mentioned the advanced method also, because we should aware those methods are there, but those methods, it's not appropriate to our part of the world. So as I mentioned, the preventive methods like wearing the offloading the patient's foot and identifying the high risk foot, and empowering the foot care, like how they can wear the footwears, and how often daily they have to examine their feet with the mirror and applying the moisturizers, and like things we can do. But when a patient develops the ulcer, then it is a shared care with the surgeon and the physician. Then we have to go with them, and whether the patient is having the active infection, we have to treat that promptly. And if the patient is having established vascular events, then we can go with the bypass surgery or the stenting of the major arteries. Those kind of things we can do. That's why I said it should be the multidisciplinary involvement. So when a patient is coming with a diabetic foot with Charcot joints, then the orthopedic surgeons also involved. So what is happening is part of the patients are solely managed by the surgical people and partly by the physician. So we should come at a point, and what else we can do for these established ulcers. So my concern is, before the patient is getting the established ulcers, we have to prevent that. Then the burden of the patient and the healthcare would be less.
Thank you very much, Dr. Darshini. I think that brings us to the end of the session, unless there are any more questions. So thank you very much to both of you for your excellent presentations. I have a small certificate, Dr. Darshini, if you don't mind. And Dr. Srirangan also, if I can invite you back on the stage, Dr. Srirangan. So that brings us to the close of this session.